The door of endless dread. It was on a night thick with rain and restless wind that Simon Caldwell first laid eyes on the peculiar door. A door that would, though he could not yet imagine it, unravel his mind in ways no earthly terror ever had, a door that stood not in some ruined castle or ancient shrine but in the unassuming heart of Carrow Lane, in a house so bland, so ordinary, that its banality itself seemed to mock the horror it contained beneath layers of beige paint and faded curtains, the kind of house you pass every day and never really see, until one day, the house sees you. Simon was not, by nature, a superstitious man. His life was built on numbers, on precise machinery, on the mechanical reliability of his work as a civil engineer, and so when the letter arrived, unsigned, yellowed with age, reading only, "You are invited to cross the threshold at number 56 Carrow Lane. Midnight." He laughed aloud in his apartment, tossing it into the bin without a second thought. But that night, as the clock struck 12, something unseen tugged at his bones, a quiet insistence that made his hands shake, made his skin crawl, until he found himself walking, dazed, half-aware, through the slick, empty streets as the storm raged above, only regaining full consciousness when he stood before the door of number 56, breathless, soaked to the marrow, and certain in the deepest part of him that he was no longer entirely in control. The house opened without a key, without a creak, and the air inside smelled of mildew, of rotted velvet and something sharper underneath, a copper tang that made the tongue recoil. Simon stepped across the threshold, the door snapping shut behind him like the jaws of a great beast, and the house, in that instant, was no longer a house at all but something much older, something hungry, its wallpaper crawling with faintly moving patterns that twisted the longer one stared, its floorboards groaning not under his feet but as though something far below them shifted, stirred, and exhaled. And then he saw it, the door. It stood alone at the end of a dark hallway lit by guttering candles, a door that seemed too tall, too narrow, the wood carved with grotesque reliefs of screaming faces, eyes gouged, mouths agape, their horror frozen in wood that seemed to pulse as if still alive. The doorknob, brass polished to a mirror shine, gleamed in the half-light, and though every instinct screamed at Simon to turn back, to flee, his legs carried him forward, hands trembling as they reached without consent. The moment his fingers brushed the metal, the whispering began. 1,000 voices, distant and close all at once, whispering his name, whispering secrets he could not understand but felt, in his teeth, in his bones, in the fragile, fraying strings of his sanity, and before he could stop himself, before he could retreat, the door opened. And the darkness inside was not absence but presence, a living, breathing, endless void that reached for him with unseen hands, and pulled him through. Simon fell, or at least, the sensation mimicked falling, though there was no air, no motion, no ground rushing up to meet him, only the endless sensation of plummeting inward, as though he were not descending through space but spiraling into the hollow well of his own mind, the edges of reality fraying with each heartbeat until he no longer knew where flesh ended and nightmare began. Around him, the darkness throbbed, vast and liquid, pulsing like a living organ, and within that void shapes emerged, glimpses of malformed creatures with too many limbs, too many mouths, their bodies stitched from fragments of remembered fears, their wet, glistening skin slick with decay and wrongness so profound it defied comprehension. When at last he landed, or thought he landed, it was upon a surface that breathed, the ground soft and warm beneath his fingertips, shivering with each exhalation of the cavernous space that stretched infinitely above and below. There were no walls, no sky, only a crimson twilight that painted the flesh-like ground in shades of rust and gore, and rising before him, far in the distance yet somehow immediate, the door stood again, identical, impossible, waiting. Each step toward it was a battle, the air itself thick with unseen claws that raked his skin, his memories unspooling in jagged bursts, his mother's voice, the sting of childhood loss, the bitter taste of betrayal, all weaponized, amplified, twisted until every breath was agony, every heartbeat a shattering scream of memory. Shadows rose and fell along the edges of his vision. Spectral figures weeping blood from hollow eyes, mouths sewn shut yet screaming silently, their presence suffocating in its weight. He tried to speak, tried to call out, but his voice unraveled into ash the moment it left his throat, words devoured by the all-consuming dark. And then he reached the door again, saw his own reflection in the polished brass, but it was wrong, his eyes black pits, his mouth stretched into a rictus grin that moved out of time with his thoughts. Hands, his hands. Grasped the knob, turned it, and the door yawned wide. Beyond the second threshold lay a corridor of living walls, tissue and sinew stretched taut, veins pulsing, the floor beneath his feet soft and wet, exuding the stench of rot and centuries-old blood. Simon staggered, his breath catching in his throat as he pressed onward, each footstep releasing a sticky squelch, every surface seeming to twitch and ripple as though aware of his intrusion. The air was thick, unbreathable, tasting of spoiled meat and old death. The whispers returned, louder now, sharper, words threading through his mind with surgical precision, peeling back memory after memory until his past lay bare, regrets sharpened into knives, sins magnified until they consumed every corner of his consciousness. He saw himself, fractured images projected onto the fleshy walls, moments of cruelty, of indifference, of casual malice. Each one twisted, exaggerated, until he was nothing but a walking vessel of guilt and shame. And then the creatures emerged, twisted parodies of human form, their limbs too long, eyes lidless and glowing with fevered light, mouths filled with jagged teeth. They did not attack, but circled, stared, mouths opening in silent laughter as they mirrored his every step, his every tremble, their bodies moving in nauseating synchrony as though puppets pulled by the same invisible strings. Simon ran, heart pounding, but the corridor stretched on without end, doors multiplying along the walls, each one unique, each one marked with symbols that burned to look upon. He flung one open, then another, and another, each room beyond revealing visions more unspeakable than the last, a child weeping in a pit of teeth, a man flayed alive while spectral hands held him down, his own face, skinless and still screaming. Exhausted, weeping, Simon collapsed. And as his body shook with ragged sobs, the door appeared again, inevitable, eternal. The fourth threshold led not into horror but into memory, or so it seemed. He stood in his childhood bedroom, the scent of old wood and books filling his lungs, the soft yellow light of the lamp casting gentle shadows on the walls. For a moment he almost wept with relief, believing perhaps it was over, a dream within a dream, a madness from which he had awakened. But then the shadows shifted. And his reflection in the cracked mirror by the bed did not move when he did. It stared, smiled, and blinked out of sync, and when he stepped closer, the glass rippled like water and his reflection stepped forward, peeling itself free in jagged slivers of flesh and bloodless tissue, a twin made not of flesh but of nightmare itself. It spoke in his voice, soft, intimate, dripping with venom, "You are the architect of your own hell, Simon. You built this. You opened the door." The room melted, colors bleeding into darkness, and he was adrift once more, the twin always just behind him, always whispering, its breath ice cold, its touch electric with madness. Faces from his life appeared and vanished, loved ones twisted into monstrous shapes, friends reduced to gibbering shadows, and through it all, the door loomed, calling, beckoning. He realized then, there was no escape. At last, he reached the final door. Or perhaps it was the first. Or perhaps it had never been anything but this, an endless spiral of terror, of mindless, ceaseless descent. Simon no longer knew his own name. He no longer knew the shape of his face, the color of his eyes, the weight of memory or meaning. He was a hollowed thing, a vessel worn thin by fear until nothing remained but motion, the endless cycle of doors within doors, each more twisted, more unforgiving than the last. The final door opened without his hand, and within it he saw himself. Saw the moment he first received the letter, the moment he first stepped inside, the infinite loop of every choice he'd made, each one leading inevitably, unavoidably, to this. He screamed, but no sound emerged. He ran, but his legs moved nowhere. The nightmare was not the door. The nightmare was him. And in the heart of the darkness, the door swung shut once more, waiting for the next soul to open it.